A country that sits on one of the largest oil reserves on Earth. A country that has spent decades threatening to plunge the entire global economy into darkness simply by closing a single waterway. A country whose leaders built a mythology of resistance so powerful they turned it into a national religion. The idea that no outside force, no matter how strong, could ever break them. That country is now asking its own citizens to turn off their lights at home, not metaphorically, literally. On April 25, 2026, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian went on state television and told his nation to stop using so many lamps. Instead of turning on 10 lamps in your home, he said, "Turn on 2. What harm could there be?" The president of a nation that controls some of the world's richest energy deposits was telling his people to sit in the dark to save money. Government offices began operating on half-day schedules. The Tan Metro reported repeated heating cuts. Streetlights in major cities like Isfahan and Tabriz were reduced by half. That is not a president managing a crisis. That is a president reading a eulogy. Welcome to States News. And welcome to the story of how Iran's greatest strategic weapon, the one it spent 47 years perfecting and threatening the world with, is being systematically dismantled, not by a single military strike, but by a silent, surgical, relentless economic siege. A siege delivered not only by the United States Navy, but by the UAE's bombshell exit from OPEC, by India quietly walking away from a project Thrawn thought was its lifeline, by China, supposedly Iran's most loyal ally, laying the very pipes that now allow its neighbors to bypass Hormuz entirely. If you've been watching this channel, you know we don't do surface-level coverage. We go deep. So, subscribe to States News right now if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell and let's go through this layer by layer, because every single layer of this story is more extraordinary than the one before it. Let's start where every energy crisis in the Gulf ultimately starts. The Strait of Hormuz. The strait is 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, just 34 kilometers separating the Persian Gulf from the open ocean. Through that narrow corridor, according to the International Energy Agency, roughly 20 million barrels of oil passed every single day before this conflict began. Approximately 20% of the entire world's seaborne oil supply. China receives about a third of its oil through it. Europe gets 12 to 14% of its liquefied natural gas from Qatar through it. Japan, South Korea, India, all critically dependent. Iran has spent decades building its foreign policy around a single proposition. Cross us and we will close that strait and the world will beg. It was the ultimate asymmetric threat. Cheap to deploy, catastrophically expensive for everyone else. Iran didn't need to win a war. It just needed to make the cost of confrontation feel unbearable. And then on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iranian targets. And Iran did exactly what it always said it would do. It closed the strait. As reported by Wikipedia's ongoing documentation of the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis, shipping traffic collapsed almost immediately, falling by more than 70% in the initial days. An IRGC senior official formally confirmed the closure on March 2nd. Iran began boarding and attacking merchant vessels. It laid sea mines in the passage. It issued warnings that any ship attempting transit did so at its own peril. Brent crude surged past $120 a barrel. The European Central Bank postponed rate cuts. Economists began warning of a global recession risk. Vitol CEO Russell Hardy later estimated that 1 billion barrels of oil production would be lost because of the war. Iran had lit the fuse, and for a moment it looked like the threat was working. But there is a critical difference between a threat that has never been tested and a threat that has. And the moment Iran actually closed the strait, it triggered a cascade of consequences its strategists had never fully modeled, because the world had spent years quietly and methodically building the infrastructure to survive without it. Here's where it gets truly remarkable. Because the response to Iran's blockade did not come primarily from bombs or battleships. It came from steel pipelines and satellite tracking systems and the cold mathematics of a Treasury secretary who writes social media posts with the tone of a man holding 4 aces. Let's talk about the U.S. naval blockade first, because this is the move that changed everything. From April 13, 2026, the United States imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports, creating what analysts began calling a dual blockade. Iran was choking off the world's energy supply through the strait, while the US was simultaneously choking off Iran's ability to export through any other route. The results were immediate and devastating. According to shipping data cited by both the Wall Street Journal and commodity analytics firm Kepler, Iranian crude and condensate loadings averaged approximately 2.1 million barrels per day in the first 2 weeks of April before the blockade. After April 13th, that number collapsed to approximately 567,000 barrels per day. Between April 14th and April 23rd, only 5 export cargoes were recorded leaving Iranian terminals. A country that was exporting 1.84 million barrels per day in March was suddenly barely moving a quarter of that volume, and the oil that wasn't being exported had to go somewhere. It was going into tanks, storage tanks that, according to Kepler analysis cited by Al Jazeera, were filling at an alarming rate. From April 13th to April 21st alone, the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy reported that Iranian oil stocks increased by more than 6 million barrels. As of April 20th, storage tanks at Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal, handling 90% of Iran's crude exports, were approximately 74% full, and oil companies generally avoid exceeding 80% capacity for safety and operational reasons. The countdown had begun. Kepler analysts estimated Iran could run out of usable storage capacity within 12 to 22 days if the blockade continued at full intensity. The Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy put similar figures in their assessments. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was blunter in a post on X on April 22nd. He wrote, "In a matter of days, Karg Island storage will be full and the fragile Iranian oil wells will be shut in." And then he added a second post with more precise language. Storage reaching capacity, he warned, would force the regime to reduce oil production, resulting in, and he gave the exact figure, an additional approximately $170 million per day in lost revenue, and causing what he described as permanent damage to Iran's oil infrastructure. Permanent, that is, the word that should make anyone in Tehran lose sleep. Because this is not just about the revenue Iran is losing today, it is about the wells that may never recover. Antoine Hall, the co-founder and chief analyst at Kairos, an environmental intelligence company that tracks energy supply chains, explained it this way to multiple outlets. Once oil wells are shut in, especially Iran's aging fields, restarting them is not guaranteed. Analysts estimate the permanent production loss at between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day. Iran would not simply be losing this month's revenue, it would be surrendering a portion of its future capacity forever. In petroleum engineering, this is called irreversible production loss. It is the point from which recovery becomes structurally impossible, not just economically painful. A blockade that lasts long enough does not just damage Iran's economy, it amputates it. But here is what makes this siege architecturally different from anything the world has seen in modern history. It is not just a blockade. It is a blockade operating inside a perfectly constructed trap, because while the US Navy is sealing Iran's export routes, every ship that tries to defy it is being tracked, intercepted, and when necessary, boarded. This is not the sanctions of the past decade where Iranian tankers would simply switch flags, turn off their AIS transponders, the automatic identification system that ships use to broadcast their position, and quietly disappear into the Pacific. A switched-off transponder is no obstacle to a U.S. Navy that is using Sentinel-2 satellite imagery, AWACS surveillance aircraft, and the full intelligence apparatus of CENTCOM. The ships are tracked individually. Their voyage histories are documented, and when CENTCOM decides to act, Marines fast rope from helicopters. As reported by CNN, CENTCOM confirmed that at least 39 vessels had been redirected since the blockade began. 3 ships, the MV Touska, the MT Tafani, and the MT Majestic X were seized outright and remain in U.S. custody. And on April 28, 2026, the Comoros-flagged MV Blue Star 3 was intercepted in the Gulf of Oman by Marines from the U.S. 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, who fast roped onto the vessel, conducted a thorough search, and released it only after confirming it was not bound for an Iranian port. The message was deliberate and unmistakable. Chabahar, Iran's Plan B. The port on the Gulf of Oman that Tehran had spent years developing precisely for this contingency. The argument being that even if Hormuz were ever blocked, Chabahar sits outside the strait entirely and could serve as an alternative export hub. It was partly developed with Indian investment. It was part of the international north-south transport corridor backed by China and Russia. Iran marketed Chabahar as its strategic trump card. Today, as the transcript notes, more than 20 tankers and cargo vessels sit jammed and waiting at Chabahar. What was supposed to be Iran's escape valve has become a parking lot because the U.S. naval blockade extends into the Gulf of Oman as well, the exact waters through which Chabahar's exports would have to travel. 6 Iranian tankers laden with oil, as reported by satellite imagery and cited by oilprice.com, have been loitering in a cluster near the port, loaded and unable to move, sitting just inside the U.S. blockade line. And then India made its calculation. India, which had invested in Chabahar development, quietly shelved that investment and signed a new contract with the UAE's Fujairah terminal. Iran's bridge to Asia is being abandoned by its own partners. The exits are closing one by one. This is a good moment to pause, because what we are watching is not just a military operation, it is a geopolitical restructuring happening at extraordinary speed, and the piece that deserves special attention is the UAE's decision announced on April 28, 2026. The United Arab Emirates, OPEC's third largest oil producer, a member of the cartel since 1967, nearly 6 decades of continuous membership, announced it was leaving OPEC and the wider OPEC Plus alliance effective May 1, 2026. The shock came from multiple directions simultaneously. First, the timing. The UAE is leaving in the middle of a historic energy crisis, precisely the moment when OPEC's coordination theoretically should matter most. UAE Energy Minister Suhail al-Mazzoui told CNN that the country chose this moment deliberately because the Strait of Hormuz's closure would limit the immediate market impact of the announcement. In other words, Abu Dhabi calculated that now, while exports are constrained anyway, is the moment to position for a future after the war. A future where the UAE wants total freedom of action to maximize production without quota restrictions. Second, the context. The UAE has been on the receiving end of Iran's most intense attacks throughout this conflict. Al Jazeera reported that of all Iran's regional neighbors who came under fire, the UAE was hit harder than Israel and all other GCC countries combined. Iranian ballistic missiles and drones struck UAE energy facilities repeatedly. The Habshan gas complex was targeted. The Fujairah oil terminal came under attack. And yet, as an OPEC member, the UAE was technically still in an organization that includes Iran as a fellow member, a country currently bombing its infrastructure. Leaving OPEC is Abu Dhabi telling the world in the most institutionally formal way possible, we are no longer willing to coordinate energy policy in any structure that includes the country attacking us. And third, the strategic dimension that Tehran finds most unbearable. By exiting OPEC, the UAE can unilaterally increase production to 5 million barrels per day by 2027, a target its energy minister confirmed publicly without any quota constraints. And its oil already has a route to market that bypasses the strait entirely. That 380-kilometer Habshan-Fujairah pipeline carrying between 1.5 and 1.88 million barrels per day directly to the Gulf of Oman has seen exports surge 57% since March 2026, as cited in the original transcript. With OPEC quotas removed, the UAE can flood global markets with oil that Iran's closure cannot touch. OPEC's share of global supply control has already dropped from approximately 30% to 26% as a consequence of this conflict. A high oil price was one of the few remaining buffers for Iran's shadow export revenues. Even oil sold under sanctions and through illicit channels generates more when the price per barrel is elevated. The UAE's exit and its production ambitions threatens to push prices down. Iran would then be losing both export volume and per barrel revenue simultaneously, a two-front economic collapse. If you're finding this analysis valuable, this is exactly the kind of coverage States News exists to provide. Make sure you're subscribed, make sure you have notifications enabled, and share this video with someone who wants to genuinely understand what is happening, because we are only halfway through this story. Let us now go inside Thailand, because the most extraordinary data point in this entire crisis is not what is happening at sea. It is what is happening inside the regime's own security apparatus. On approximately April 27, 2026, Iran's Supreme National Security Council convened an emergency meeting. It was chaired by Council Secretary Mohammad Bagher Zolatar. According to sources cited by Iran International, whose exclusive report spread through global press in waves of shock, the security agencies that presented at this meeting did not offer optimistic assessments, contingency plans, or strategic alternatives. They presented what sources described as a highly critical picture. Language that, in the context of a regime that built its identity on the concept of the fortress economy, is nothing short of extraordinary. Three core conclusions emerged from that meeting. First, that protests could break out again within days. Second, that the regime could withstand the blockade for at most 6 to 8 weeks. Third, that by the end of spring, approximately 2 million jobs could be lost in the private sector. As reported by I-24 News, citing the same Iran international sourcing, security agencies highlighted widespread job losses linked to the shutdown of industrial units in oil, petrochemical, and steel sectors. Iranian steel exports were officially halted. Recovery from strikes on major steel facilities was expected to take years. The 60-day internet shutdown, yes, 60 days, had already left roughly 20% of workers dependent on internet-based employment with no income. Banks, stock exchanges, and currency markets had been largely frozen, nearly paralyzing economic activity, and the officials drew one final conclusion that is perhaps the most chilling sentence produced by any government body in this entire conflict. According to multiple outlets citing Iran International, the security agencies concluded that renewed protests are inevitable. Not possible, not likely, inevitable. The only uncertainty, they said, was the timing. This is not a threat assessment prepared by an outside intelligence agency. This is the regime's own security apparatus putting in writing that its streets are likely to turn against it, and the only question is which day it happens. The World Bank had already projected before the war in October 2025 that Iran's economy would shrink in both 2025 and 2026, with annual inflation rising towards 60%. Iran's currency, the rial, had hauled in value between July 2024 and March 2025, before the war even began. Food price inflation in Iran was above 70% in 2025. These are the conditions upon which the war's economic pressure is now stacking. As reported by the House of Commons Library in a research briefing from April 2026, protests had already swept all 31 of Iran's provinces beginning in late December 2025. Before the war, before the blockade, driven purely by domestic economic despair. Now add the blockade, add the loss of oil revenues, add the industrial shutdowns, add the internet blackouts, add the medicine prices rising nearly 60% as imported pharmaceuticals become inaccessible. Add the lines for bread, meat, and milk growing longer in cities where the lights are already being turned off. Officials at the SNSC meeting reportedly expressed particular concern about International Workers' Day, May 1, 2026, as a flashpoint. Labor groups had been calling for wage increases, the release of detained activists, and the right to form independent unions. Security forces had been placed on heightened alert. The council reportedly warned that protests occurring during ongoing U.S.-Iran negotiations could pose a real threat to the survival of the Islamic Republic itself. Let that sink in. Iran's own Security Council is using the phrase survival of the Islamic Republic in its internal assessments. Trump himself overclaimed when he told Fox News that Iran's oil infrastructure was days away from exploding. Experts pushed back on that framing, noting Iran has more runway than 3 days. Kapiller's own estimates still give Iran at least 2 weeks of storage capacity even after production reductions. Ferrer told CNBC the core question is who has a longer runway, Trump or Iran? That is the honest version of this story. The blockade is inflicting severe accelerating damage, but it is not an instantaneous knockout. It is a progressive asphyxiation, and the timeline is weeks to months, not days. What is clear, however, is that every week the blockade holds, Iran's position deteriorates structurally, not cyclically. The damage to oil wells, the loss of industrial infrastructure, the proxy network defunding, the currency collapse, the domestic unrest. These are not problems that resolve when a ceasefire is signed. They compound. And the SNSC's own 6TUAE estimate reflects not the total collapse of the regime, but the point at which the economic pain becomes domestically uncontrollable. Which brings us to Iran's most revealing miscalculation. Trump dismissed Thrawn's offer, the one the transcript describes as, "Let's reopen Hormuz and set the nuclear issue aside for later," without even pausing. According to reporting from CNN and multiple outlets covering the Islamabad peace talks of April 12th, Iran's negotiating position had not moved substantively. The Institute for the Study of War assessed on April 28th that Iran's latest proposal shifted focus to the Strait rather than nuclear issues, but otherwise presented no new concessions. The American delegation left Islamabad without a deal. Trump authorized resumed strikes. Iran thought it could negotiate from the Hormuz threat, but the moment the East-West pipeline was running at 7 million barrels per day, the moment Fujairah was handling 1.9 million barrels of UAE oil per day, the moment the U.S. Navy had physically demonstrated it could track and board any ship in the region, the Hormuz card lost much of its value as a negotiating chip. You cannot credibly threaten to close something that the other side has already partially learned to live without. The 1979 revolution and the decades of resistance mythology were built on one premise: that Iran could absorb any pressure the outside world applied because the outside world needed Iran's oil and its compliance in the Strait more than it needed anything else. That premise collapsed in April 2026. So what comes next? And this is where every honest analyst must acknowledge the uncertainty, because a cornered regime is a dangerous regime. 3 scenarios present themselves with varying degrees of plausibility. In the first scenario, Iran negotiates its way out. It comes to the table with real concessions on its nuclear program, accepts intrusive IAEA inspection access, and reaches a comprehensive agreement that lifts the blockade. This scenario restores economic activity, but represents a profound defeat for the IRGC hardliners who have effectively governed Iran's foreign policy posture. Some analysts believe the civilian government under President Pezeshkian would accept this outcome. The question is whether the Revolutionary Guards will permit it. The IRGC still refuses, as the transcript notes, to open enriched uranium sites to inspection, and under military pressure, the civilian government cannot put that option on the table even when it wants to. In the second scenario, the blockade continues, and domestic unrest erupts. The SNSC's own assessment called this inevitable. The protests that already swept all 31 provinces in December and January, driven by economic despair before the war even began, could reignite with far greater intensity when 2 million private sector workers lose their jobs, and the regime can no longer fund the subsidies that kept the social contract intact. A government that cannot pay its proxy. Fighters in Yemen may also find it increasingly difficult to pay the security forces needed to suppress its own people. In the third scenario, the United States escalates militarily. Trump has shown no reluctance to authorize strikes. The CENTCOM planning structure has active contingency frameworks, and the political pressure from Congress and allies to achieve something definitive rather than managing an open-ended blockade while global energy prices remain elevated creates its own momentum. What we can say with confidence based on the data, the satellite imagery, the SNSC assessments, the oil export numbers, the storage tank readings, the currency crash, the proxy network defunding, and the president asking his citizens to sit in the dark. Is this the Iranian regime is facing the deepest structural crisis in its history? Not the deepest crisis of a single year, the deepest since 1979. The fortress economy narrative is over. The resistance mythology is being tested against the physics of an oil tank that is filling up faster than it can be emptied. And the regime's own Security Council has told the truth on paper that its leadership has spent 47 years refusing to say out loud unrest is inevitable. Only its timing is uncertain. The story of Iran in April and May of 2026 is ultimately a story about what happens when asymmetric leverage meets a world that prepared for it. Iran threatened Hormuz for decades, and the world quietly built pipelines. Iran threatened to deny oil revenues, and the US Navy built a blockade. Iran built proxies on oil money, and the blockade cut the oil money. Iran threatened regional hegemony, and Saudi Arabia signed a defense pact with a nuclear power and invited 13,000 elite Pakistani soldiers to its most strategic airbase. Strategy and threats are only as powerful as the assumptions underneath them remain valid. When those assumptions collapse, when Hormuz is no longer the only exit, when the blockade is tighter than sanctions ever were, when India quietly walks away from Chabahar, when China builds the bypass pipeline, when the UAE exits OPEC and opens Fujairah, when Thrawn's own Security Council writes the word inevitable in an emergency meeting, the mythology does not die loudly. It turns off the lights one lamp at a time. The chess game in the Gulf has reached the stage where every move carries irreversible consequences. The economic siege is tightening, the domestic pressure is building, the diplomatic runway is narrowing, and the regime that built its identity on the idea that no one could break it is now watching its own strategic council count down the weeks. Where this goes from here, surrender, unrest, or escalation will define not just Iran's future, but the architecture of Middle Eastern power for a generation. States News will be here covering every development, every shift in the blockade, every tanker that moves or doesn't move, every protest that sparks or doesn't spark, every word that comes out of Islamabad and Thrawn and Washington. If you want analysis at this depth, not headlines, not spin, but the full picture with the real numbers and the real stakes, subscribe to States News right now. Hit the notification bell. Share this video with someone who is trying to understand the world, and tell us in the comments, do you think Iran will find a way to the table before the economic pressure becomes uncontrollable? Or is the regime betting it can outlast the blockade? We read every comment, and we want to know what you think. Thank you for watching States.